Welcome everyone to the fourth and final event of the NAADSN Ideas Series, NATO at 75, a four-part virtual series exploring Canada's role and involvement in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in the lead up to its 75th birthday today. My name is Nicholas Gillespie, the NAADSN Administrator and incoming PhD student in Canadian Studies at Trent University. And the North American and Arctic Defense and Security Network is a Minds collaborative network which addresses three core policy challenges: defense in the Arctic, securing North America and enhancing continental defense, and climate change and the environment. NAADSN engages key academic experts and stakeholders across Canada, North America, and the circumpolar Arctic to produce timely research and advice to the defense team and to foster the next generation of scholars and practitioners. And today we are exploring the alliance of the future. Our discussion will be moderated by NAADSN Research Fellow Olivia Wynne Hook, a PhD candidate in history, theory, and criticism of architecture at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where she focuses on the intersection of the built environment, diplomacy, and geopolitics during the Cold War. She's particularly interested in the interplay between NATO, American and Nordic foreign policies, technology, and infrastructure in the European and North American Arctics, and her work considers NATO as well. So Olivia, I will turn the floor over to you.
Hi, Nick. Thank you so much for this for that introduction. And I also want to wish NATO a happy 75th birthday. It looks great for its age, but I think that's going to be that will come up as part of our debate today. So first, I will introduce our three panelists and then give each of them 10 to 15 minutes to speak before conducting our Q&A session. So first is Mr. Robert Baines. He is the president and CEO of the NATO Association of Canada, where he is focused on communicating the importance of NATO and the international rules-based order to Canadians. The association is a charitable nonprofit which hosts events across Canada, publishes hundreds of articles online every year, and engages young Canadians about NATO through social media. So next we have Dr. Anessa Kimball, who is a professor of political science at Laval University. They are the co-director of the Canadian Defense and Security Network and author of Beyond 2%, NATO Partners, Institutions, and Burden Management, Concepts, Risks, and Models. And Dr. Kimball studies how international defense and security institutions mitigate strategic problems. They are currently working with the NATO CEE Center of Intelligence. And finally, we have Dr. Stephanie von Latke, who is a professor of political studies and the Canada Research Chair in Gender, Security, and Armed Forces at Queen's University. Dr. von Latke is a co-director of the Canadian Defense and Security Network and author of Deploying Feminism, the Role of Gender in NATO Military Operations. Her research interests are NATO, military culture, women, peace, and security. So welcome everyone, and thank you for being here. I will first pass the mic to Mr. Baines.
Thanks so much, Olivia, and a great pleasure to be here, especially with two of my very favorite NATO people, Stephanie and Anessa. An honor to always be accompanying you on any panel, anywhere. But especially in the Arctic context, I'm really thrilled to speak as well. It's been a great series you've had on this spring about the importance of NATO, and I'm so glad we've been able to reach many Canadians with this topic. When we talk about NATO's future, most people know me. I'm an optimist. I do see the terror that we have throughout our world. Every day we see it on social media, just constantly assaulting us, essentially. But I am optimistic that we do have NATO, this amazing tool with which we can help to maintain the world that we have spent so much effort building. And I just wanted to dwell on three main things. They're pretty easy to digest, and of course Stephanie and Anessa will talk about a lot of the details behind them, I'm sure. But really, just the first is maintaining unity. The second is developing and maintaining our narrative to our citizens, which of course is my bread and butter. And then the third is consistency in making sure that every state and government that's a member of NATO really holds on to the requirements of NATO and the rest of the rules-based order itself, the whole idea of non-zero-sum collaboration. So when I talk about maintaining unity, So sorry, got a call there. When we talk about maintaining unity, that is job number one for NATO. It always has been. It's always been a challenge to maintain the alliance's cohesion. Creating consensus is always, maddening when you're just trying to do it with a few friends, let alone 32 nations now and some of the most powerful in the world. It's really essential to maintain that unity and to ensure the traditional 3 C's of deterrence, capability, commitment, and communication. And that is one of the things that so many people in the past few years have forgotten in the discussion space, I think. Donald Trump is, of course, always brought up with the communication aspect as well. But I keep getting hit with questions about, didn't Donald Trump do a good thing for NATO? And shouldn't that be the future? Shouldn't be the goal to chide each other into spending more? Well, convincing Canada and other NATO allies to spend more is definitely something that has to be done going on to the future, to maintain that unity, to make sure that everybody feels comfortable with the level of support that our allies are fielding for NATO. But the key aspect of communication underlies all of the deterrent strategy of NATO. We need to be able to show people, specifically those who mean to test and perhaps be antagonistic towards NATO, that we are committed to it, no matter what. I had a question the other day of a gentleman saying, I hear you speak, and it sounds like you think NATO needs to spend more, that Canada needs to spend more to enable to lift up some of the burden from the United States. Isn't that just what Mr. Trump was saying? You sound like you're saying the same thing. But the key difference has been that aspect of against all odds, no matter what. This is not a protection racket. This is not a situation where if you do not reach this level X, we will not support you. NATO cannot operate that way, and it's the whole aspect behind deterrence is knowing that it'll happen no matter what, having no question about that. You'll hear the Secretary General mentioning NATO will protect every inch of NATO territory, and every NATO leader has pretty much just regurgitated that again and again, and that's why the communication works. That's the deterrent aspect. So that, for me, maintaining that unity, the credibility of the deterrence, and the communication of that is always going to be number one going forward. And when we have a lot of riven discussions, a lot of discussions of different parties saying we should or should not support NATO more within each NATO country, that's always going to be a difficulty. But keeping our eye on the ball where we want to be, which is to maintain the rules-based international order, NATO's unity is essential to that idea and the consensus built with it. I'd like to just talk briefly about the narrative aspect too, though. In the past few decades, Canada and many other countries have been less willing to kind of put up front what it is we're trying to do with NATO and the rules-based international order. We have been concerned with many different problems we have in our societies, and boy, don't we have a lot. In Canada alone, truth and reconciliation has come to the fore, certainly in the past decade and more, and that's a terrific thing. That's great, but it is something that has to be done with a balanced view. We get a lot of the successor generations being very frustrated with government, and that is just amplified on social media. Not surprisingly, I'm angry about a lot of things that are going on in the country, but that is something that's part of being a democracy. Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others. And we just have to kind of put that in context with what can be reasonably expected of our societies, our country, NATO itself. The rules-based international order is the worst order, except for all the others. And the same thing with NATO. So I think that we just have to make sure that we can tell this narrative. What is it that we're trying to do? Where are we trying to go? Well, we're trying to make sure that we have a safe and secure world where many countries can continue to live and flourish culturally. It's one of those things that most Canadians don't ever have to think about, but it is something that we have to put on as job number one, to maintain our world and the world that we want, the world in our that's in our values and in our interest to maintain what we have. And just to go on a bit of a side discussion, I think that the challenge is that we often have discussions from a very critical point of view, which is always great. That's the basis of our civilization, essentially, is critiquing and then correcting. But a lot of our education, I think, is based on the idea of like critique from a lens of critique, as opposed to teaching a bit about gratitude and about the institutions that we have before we critique them. I certainly come up with, we have a terrific internship program at the NATO Association, and so many of our interns come in with lots of critiques, but not a lot of knowledge about the institutions that they are critiquing. And that's not surprising. They're very complex. But I think that's where the government of Canada and so many other governments have to put out some idea about what are we fighting for? What is the narrative that Canada believes in? You'll see a lot of discussion about disinformation. Global Affairs Canada, Department of National Defense have been great about disinformation. Watch out for it. Here's what's wrong. It's not true. That's great. But what's our story? What is the story that the disinformation is trying to knock over? Well, we're not telling it. Really, well, not particularly well anyways, in a narrative structure. Tell me a story about what it is we're for. And that kind of, we're receding the information space so that we're so susceptible to disinformation. And I think that's something we have to talk to more about NATO and the rules-based international order as Canada's grand strategy. And Anessa knows I love to talk about this, but it is really the star to which we are guarding our ship of state, or sorry, guiding our ship of state. That's what we're reaching for, is a world that is peaceful, prosperous, and secure, which is not something that's common in the history of humanity. So perhaps I'll just stop there, but I would like to also just mention that the consistency that kind of vision gives to our public wheel, shall we say, the consistency that can give to our politicians would allow us to better sustain NATO, i.e. reach the 2% GDP in defense spending. It helps us because then Canadians would know, well, what the hell are you doing with that? Why are you spending that much? They're not gonna acquiesce to that kind of spending unless we have a good reason for it, and we can explain it, articulate it in a way that makes sense in their lives and makes them feel like they're participating in creating the world we want. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was a very rousing, but also very optimistic kind of take on things, and I super appreciate the optimism in that sense. It's really nice to hear it. So we are going to keep going. Dr. Kimball, if you want to take the floor.
Sure. I'm glad that, Robert spoke about some of the historical context, and he spoke about the collective defense. I like to draw a couple of arguments that I think are really important that the Canadian public needs to understand. And so one thing is that when we think about NATO as political scientists and folks that try to study politics, one of the things we talk about is kind of how NATO helps Canada manage this essential problem, which is essentially trying to provide national security and trying to provide domestic security, right? We call this the guns versus butter trade-off. 20 years ago, I wrote a dissertation on this in which I essentially argued that the reason why we see these very large welfare states in all of the other NATO countries except the United States is because the United States does not have public health care. And so essentially, one other thing we can think about is that the savings we get from collectively defending ourselves through NATO allows Canada to prosper, to have education that's funded, to have healthcare that's funded. When you look at the United States, these are issues that they struggle with a lot. And these are literally things that divide the parties. And so in some senses, NATO has allowed Canada and almost all of our other European partners to develop these wonderful governments, democratic governments and social healthcare systems we benefit from today. And so I think that's really important because we don't drive that home enough. The second thing is that for Canadians, defense is the fourth largest portfolio our government spends on. And this is after employment, workplace inclusion, treasury, and finance. So after paying off civilians, after paying off the government and itself, we pay to protect ourselves. right? And I don't think Canadians understand how important that is in a comparative context. And so to give you an understanding, we spend about $27 billion, between 27 billion and 29 on defense, and we spend 27 million on foreign affairs in a comparative context. And much of our kind of media space and talking space is about foreign policy issues, and we kind of neglect those defense aspects. But frankly, we spend a lot, and we are going to be required to spend more there, as we know with the 2% pledge. And so I think it's important that Canadians kind of understand we spend a lot on defense, but we actually need to spend more, and we probably spend less than other countries that consider themselves more well defended. It's also important to note that NATO has been responsible for a large portion of Canada's military deployments, one way or another. I know Stephanie can speak to this much more clearly, but when, Canada being on the international stage, it does this through its activities in NATO in a large extent. And it's also important to note that, NATO has created an environment where Canada has been able to develop these really close interoperable defense relations with 31 other partners. It may have developed relations close with the US and France and the UK and maybe Germany, but it would never have done that with all of those 20 some other partners, right? And so essentially we're getting a lot more than we put in the aspect of simply being able to call up pick up the phone to our NATO partner and discuss things. And I think that this really drives home when we see what Canada is doing in Latvia, and I cannot stop underlining the importance of Canada as the country with the smallest military, which is leading the third largest mission now in enhanced forward presence. And it's also leading and collaborating with the most partners, almost by double. 1 in 8 NATO partners is under Canada's leadership in Latvia currently. This is important. Canada would not be doing that otherwise. And I think that this is what makes Canada relevant. It's what makes and keeps our defense capable. I know a lot of us kind of complain that we could be spending more and we could be doing more. But I think in a world without NATO, we would be living in a drastically different defense situation. And I don't want to really think about that type of counterfactual. And, I think that the other thing that we also have the NATO adjacent mission, which is Operation Unifier, which is supporting Ukraine. So we've been talking a lot about NATO, Ukraine, and I don't think NATO is giving Canada enough kind of public credit for the importance of Unifier, right? And the fact that we've trained almost 40,000, military and armed forces in support of what NATO is doing there. And this is a purely bilateral mission. And so I think that's another important aspect. We talk about Canada maybe being a free rider. I think it's very clear that Canada participates as much as it can. Trump says, if you don't pay your dues, NATO's not going to protect you. Well, Trump is wrong because NATO doesn't have dues. It's not like Videotron and you get a little thing saying your bill is due. No, they have common funded agreements, and I can confirm to you, I have followed them for the last dozen cycles. Canada pays, Canada carries. It's part of the load there. So a lot of my other arguments are essentially about trying to break this discourse about free riding because, again, I spent time in Europe and I traveled to over a dozen NATO partners in Central and Eastern Europe. They don't think Canada is a free rider. Our partners believe Canada is absolutely pulling its load in NATO. We think that, we say that about a lot in our media, and I think that that's totally valid and important. But I think we also shouldn't beat ourselves up very much, because it's clear to me a lot of the other countries in NATO, particularly the smaller allies, look to Canada as an example of leadership, and frankly, they wonder how it is we do everything that we do with so little we give and such a small military we have. I mean, honestly, they kind of want to unlock what Canada's got. And so, I think we need to be a little more, I think we can be optimistic, but we have to realize that, NATO is also an institution that is increasing its place and its role in the world. We are seeing this with NATO taking on energy security, disinformation, climate change. These are things in NATO of 75 years ago was not really looking at, interested in. And I think that's also important to note that the NATO of today is adapting. It is innovating, and it is really kind of stepping up to the challenges and really trying to be useful for the states. And I think in maybe 5 or 10 years, we're going to talk about NATO and Canada like the Europeans talk about the EU. And I think that that would be a good thing for Canadians to understand and appreciate NATO. I mean, maybe not all Europeans appreciate the EU totally, but they do all, have opinions about it and are engaged about it. And I think that beats what we have going on in Canada about NATO. And so with that, I will pass it over to Stephanie.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Dr. Von Latke, you're up.
Thank you very much. And thank you so much for the invitation. I'm happy to see the NAADSN crew here for this panel. I'm very happy too that we get to do our panel on the anniversary itself. So thank you for that opportunity. I will pick up on some of the themes that were shared thus far because I think they're really fundamental. And I will say, just jumping off of Vanessa's last comments, that in 2024, I do feel like there is greater awareness. I remember stepping into my first class in September of 2013 at Queen's and teaching the intro course to international politics and just testing knowledge on NATO and other international institutions. And it wasn't as salient and it wasn't grabbing the headlines as much. Sure, there was a war in Afghanistan, but not everyone associated that with NATO per se. They were more focused on the national commitments and operations our troops were directly involved in. So I do think there's been a progression, but obviously not for the reasons we would like to see, because it's great power competition. It's also the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And so it's in the headlines, but just because the world is a more dangerous place, and we need to more closely coordinate to reinforce collective defense and deterrence. So it's an opportunity, going back to what Robert said about how we communicate about things, but it's also very worrying because the trend lines that we were seeing, let's say in the 1990s and the early 2000s, where it was looking like there could be sustained dialogue and partnership with Russia, well, that really doesn't seem to be on the table for the foreseeable future, and for good reason. So we need to move on. And the way that NATO has moved on is really reintegrate this focus of collective defense and deterrence, a focus which had never gone away per se. It was always part of the core tasks or pillars of NATO. But you can see with the updated strategic concept of NATO, which really articulates the major priorities for the alliance, as well as the last summit communiques, and you can really see that from 2014, but certainly more forcefully in 2022 and 2023, that collective defense and deterrence had to be rethought. And had to be rethought not only in terms of making sure that conventional capabilities were being rebuilt, and rethink about how the nuclear component fits into that, but also thinking in terms of a broader range of security challenges. And in acknowledging that, NATO has moved forward and followed suit in terms of how the United States has defined different domains of operation through a multi-domain operations concept to think deterrence along those lines. So deterrence not only in the conventional sense or in the nuclear deterrence sense, but also what does deterrence look like in the cyber domain? What does deterrence look like in the information domain, understanding that disinformation tactics are a tool that adversaries use in their hybrid warfare strategies. So it's a lot more complex. It's not your Cold War deterrence. It's really made it more difficult to coordinate. So I often like to do this comparison between the Cold War and what we're seeing today in 2024. And it's not only making sure that you adapt deterrence to suit 32 member states compared to, let's say, 12 member states in 1949 when the alliance was initially stood up, but it's also addressing a multitude of military domains, but also a number of policy issue areas. So we can get back to that in the Q&A. Certainly, I think it would be of interest to the audience here, but, you know, going from nuclear deterrence and concerns of non-proliferation and disarmament to climate change and women, peace and security and energy security and leveraging NATO to respond to emergencies like COVID. So there's a lot more going on. There's a lot more complexity, and it's through that that we risk missing the core message of what NATO really is for. So as much as NATO has been adept at adapting through the different security shifts and phases and periods from Cold War to post-Cold War, the war on terrorism, to dealing with the resurgence of a more aggressive Russia, an adversarial Russia, it has also led to some challenges, because as you grow and as you integrate more things on your to-do list, it does create coordination challenges, and that ability to maintain unity and cohesion is stress tested. Luckily, passed the test in 2022, but it has to be sustained over the medium to long term, specifically in terms of NATO's support to Ukraine. So I think that, you know, yes, deterrence and collective defense are back at the core, but the biggest challenge, considering everything that I just mentioned, is to be able to credibly signal that the political commitment is as strong as ever when it's constantly under attack through various tactics, including disinformation. Next, I want to pivot to the capabilities, because that came up also in the two previous presentations. A lot of focus on the 2%, a lot of focus on Article 5 seeming conditional when you're hearing President Trump on the campaign trail. And so undoubtedly, there will be a huge focus on what allies bring to the table, who's meeting the 2%, who's not, how the 2% will become a floor and not a ceiling, and really closely tracking the progression on that front, and media attention really on that issue as well. This is one of the issues that just doesn't disappear from media coverage. So I think it's worth paying attention to, because it's through that prism that most people hear about NATO. It's what Trump says about NATO. It's the 2%, and then maybe a little bit on operations after that. So understanding that in the short term, I don't think Canada can pivot as quickly as NATO or the United States might want it to. Just, you know, adding $20 billion of defense spending overnight is just not going to happen. And so I think we need to get out, especially as scholars, we need to get out of that binary thinking of meeting the 2% or not meeting the 2%. And if you're not able to do that level of spending, then how are you reorganizing your defense forces and your capabilities to meet the security goals? Because ultimately, NATO has set a number of priorities and security objectives that it wants to meet. And so Canada needs to think, with its current spending levels, understanding that there is a positive trend line in terms of, you know, slowly increasing defense budget, at least in absolute terms. How is Canada best positioned to meet those objectives, those common objectives? And also part of the equation for thinking about Canada's military capacity has to do with military personnel. And on that front too, even if we did have, you know, a massive increase in the defense budget, would we be able to recruit enough people to fill the critical gap when it comes to military personnel? Right now, it's so over 10,000 regular force, and, you know, closer to 15,000 when you include reservists. So that's a huge gap to fill, and a major recruitment and retention challenge for the years to come. So there's this other challenge that we maybe talk about a bit less when we talk about NATO and NATO capabilities and national capacity. But it's a challenge that Canada is not alone in facing. It's a challenge that is shared with many Canada's NATO allies, and so that forces us to rethink how we adapt the defense apparatus, understanding that there are capability shortfalls, understanding that massive increases in the defense budget appear unlikely in the short term, and understanding that there are really serious military personnel shortage. And that, I think that's where we need a broader societal discussion about how we address those gaps in terms of defense workforces. And you can see how those conversations are happening already in defense circles, especially in Europe. We're talking a lot about total defense forces, concepts that were in vogue in the Cold War, but that are being updated to meet the challenges of today, and how to integrate defense civilians more closely into furthering some of the security and military objectives that NATO or on a national level have been set out. There's also a role for industry, for civil society, for external experts to maybe promote greater integration within that community of security and defense, understanding that there are critical gaps elsewhere, and we just can't expect the military to do it all. And so we need to think more creatively instead of like continuing to be locked into that debate over 2% versus no 2%. You know, it's not happening in the next 3 to 5 years. I would be willing to make a bet on that, unless the security environment dramatically changes and worsens further still. So let's think more creatively, and I think that kind of national dialogue, that whole of nation approach to thinking about security and defense is required, especially if we're not willing to make sacrifices in the short term to meet that 2% goal. With the time I have left, I will talk about the Women, Peace and Security agenda, because NATO is using the next summit as a platform to launch its new Women, Peace and Security policy. So it's been updated in 2024. It's currently, in final draft form. And so over the last year, there have been consultations with experts. There's been a special study commissioned on NATO's Women, Peace and Security policy. And there's been re-engagement with NATO's civil society advisory panel on women, peace and security, which I'm happy to sit on. And so those discussions occurred in January. And so I think what we can expect to see with this new policy, and as it's being released sometime between now and the summit, but certainly celebrated more publicly at the summit, is this bigger focus on collective defense and deterrence, which has been a challenge for NATO to articulate. So NATO has focused a lot on diversity, so improving diversity within NATO structures, something that's evolved a lot in the last 75 years, both within NATO headquarters, but also in terms of the participation of women in NATO military operations. And then something that Canadians might know more as a gender-based analysis plus, but integrating a gender perspective in the policy and operational planning tasks of NATO, to use NATO vocabulary. And so how do you adapt those considerations to talk about deterrence and collective defense? I think that will be beefed up in the policy. Previously, you could see how the policy was influenced by NATO's experience in Afghanistan and also Iraq, but really a lot of population-centric operations where consulting and engaging with different segments of the local population was critical for NATO to achieve its goals. So watch out for this updated policy. It's going to be out very soon, and it's one of the areas I think that's undergone some significant changes over time. Even though it's a fairly young policy, the extent to which it's been institutionalized in the last 15 years is still pretty impressive, considering that organizational resistance has been quite present since its inception in 2007. So again, thank you to my two co-panelists for kicking things off so dynamically by highlighting really some of the core issues of the day as far as NATO is concerned. And thank you for all those in the audience for engaging on this topic as well. Over to you, Olivia.
Fantastic. Thank you all for those insightful and enthusiastic comments. And it's very exciting. We have a lot of time for Q&A, so this is going to be great. So in terms of the Q&A, in order to ask a question, you can just unmute yourself and ask the question, and or you can put the question in the chat and I'll read them. And I'm going to kind of be working between those modalities throughout this. But I'm going to take the luxury of asking the first question. So the discussions today talked a lot about public messaging, countering assumptions, and also kind of building a new narrative for NATO in the 21st century. And kind of staying in line with the theme of this panel, which is the future of NATO, I'd love to hear your thoughts on these things in relation to the most current events. So the war in Ukraine and then the accession of Sweden and Finland into NATO. So how have these events shifted the narrative and the public opinion? Has it been in a positive? Has it been in a negative way, or both? And then how can these events be better leveraged in NATO's building of a new narrative in the 21st century? So this is open questions. It is an open question to everyone.
I'm happy to just kick it off a little bit, but the most magnificent change in public opinion obviously was Sweden and Finland. The polling that happened before in January of 2022 and then in March of 2022 as far as support for joining NATO, I mean, that was just a tidal wave of support. And it does take me back to, what is it that NATO is protecting? The Secretary General has always been so clear on this. Nearly 1 billion citizens and their lives, what they care about. And that is really, I mean, when it comes to Finland and Sweden, that was just so unequivocal. And I just think that for Canada, we need to articulate that a bit better. Most Canadians will not have read the NATO Charter. It's pretty simple language, elegant, but and also very short. But the preamble is kind of what it is that we believe in. What are the values of democracy, of our institutions, of our culture and our heritage. And those are the kinds of things that I think we really need to push through. The problem becomes when you start putting a price tag on that. All of the most recent polls that have occurred in Canada have definitely shown a significant increase in the desire to meet 2%, to support NATO more, to do what we should be doing. But when it's comparative, that is the true challenge. Where does that rack up on an education system where we don't have enough teachers, a health system where we don't have enough doctors, social services which aren't able to meet what we need? Obviously, that is in relief to what Anessa was talking about, that we have been subsidized by the United States to a level of expectation, which is perhaps a little unrealistic, but nobody ever wants to hear that. So it really does require a significant push on narrative discussion. What would be called, and I'm sure this is why the Canadian government doesn't do it, what would be seen as propaganda, essentially. What is your agenda? We're putting our agenda before you. Unfortunately, everybody is now wary of that. Everybody sees a back room of people trying to manipulate the public. So it's just a challenging conversation, but it's one that we need to put out there. Why we should be putting this out there, and why do Canadians think we shouldn't be? If you're going to be wary of a Canadian centric story about what it is we're trying to do, why is that? Well, what do you think we should do? Surely this is the way we should work transparently. We've already put the rules-based international order as the #1 foreign policy goal, which is what strong, secure, and engaged, our defense policy, kind of worked off of for the engaged aspect. Anyways, I just think that is a true challenge that we do have to take a look at when it comes to public, the changing opinions of the public since the Ukrainian invasion, or the Russian invasion of Ukraine, excuse me.
Fantastic, thank you. Dr. Kimball or Dr. Von Lackey, do you guys have a comment? Otherwise, we can move on to the next question.
I mean, I would just add real quick that on Finland and Sweden joining NATO, I think one of the other things that we haven't talked very much about is how this is really important, interesting, and this changes kind of the Arctic balance. And so even though, and because we're at NAADSN, I feel like I need to bring this up. And so, in a very functional way, like, because I'm a data person, right? And I like to count things. And so if you add literally the Finnish and the Swedish icebreakers, now there is actually a balance between the NATO 7 versus Russia. In terms of accessing the Arctic, right? Before, Canada was at a large disadvantage, as we know. We were relying a lot upon allies. And so I think one other thing that we have seen, and I know I have observed this, probably Robert and others, is that there's really also been a developing this work in Ottawa about developing closer relations with our Nordic partners, both within NATO and outside NATO, in this larger context of thinking about the Arctic and what that means, and what kind of those countries in NATO implies for the Arctic, though we very much try to remove security and defense aspects from talking about the Arctic. I think that they are now being brought in indirectly because of what has happened with those two countries. And then the other thing I would note is that these two countries are generally cast as security providers to NATO. They would not be entering NATO and be kind of security demanders, right? And so this is also a distinction with Ukraine, right? We talk about, well, how come Finland and Sweden got in and Ukraine didn't, right? I wrote a whole paper. I can tell you, we'll talk about this for a while, but I can say that one key aspect is that, when all of the other NATO partners who have to approve any country entering NATO looked at Finland and Sweden, they saw these as countries that would, eat, despite being close to Russia and having large borders, they still were perceived as providing security. And part of this is because when Finland calls up all of its reserves, it actually has the 4th largest military in NATO, which I think is quite impressive for a country that size that was neutral for over 200 years.
Just to piggyback on that quickly, I think also in terms of resonating with Canadians, bringing that circumpolar angle into discussions about NATO will be strategic, to be completely honest. So I know I won't go back to what was already said about, the reluctance of Canada to engage NATO on the Arctic in the past. But I think that with this really coherent block of states within NATO who are part of the circumpolar north, I think a focus on like building the Arctic into the NATO narrative, I think will resonate with Canadians in a way that some of the other NATO topics may not. So just something to consider there in terms of narratives and messaging. And then finally, I'll just go back to the importance of what Canada says publicly. And it's less about how you craft your narrative, but it's more about your perception as a reliable alliance partner, which is our currency. So, again, circling back to the 2% or the 2%, 20%. It's just when Canada makes a public commitment like this in an alliance forum and then has no intention to back it up, it just undermines your word, period. And I think that we need to have a bigger conversation about publicly stated foreign and defense policy commitments that Canada makes. And then when you repeatedly don't meet them, what that means for your reputation and how other allies might perceive you as reliable or not. So it's great that that Canada keeps on having a leadership role in a bunch of different military operations, but NATO is all about what have you done for me lately. So if there's a gap in terms of that level of involvement, then our reputation will suffer precipitously if we don't do what we say we're going to do over time.
Can I just jump in on the Arctic as well? Obviously, we have to address that, but I was just a judge at the U of T Policy-thon, and it was a competition, and part of it was all about the Arctic. And every single team, you realize the utility of trying to create dual-use infrastructure in the Arctic, to shore up our northern communities, to build them into that idea of sovereignty. And these were people from all sorts of different policy chop backgrounds, if you will, but they all realized the value of that and the possibility of, the utility of arguing for that to be included in 2%. And I know Vanessa and many others have talked about the ability to utilize Arctic infrastructure in that. that. But I just thought it was an important point that going forward in the future, I do think that is a heartstring aspect for Canadians. That's why Stephen Harper used it for the National Shipbuilding Strategy. It didn't all pan out, but that's still, that core, I think, is correct.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. All right. Rohan Jain, you're up, and then Joanne Archibald, you're next. So you can just unmute yourself and ask.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Rohan. I am a JD MES student. I'm actually doing my joint thesis on a clean energy transition in the context of the growing space and AI race that we will soon be undergoing in an economy and like foreign defense standpoint. So NATO is actually, I guess, a big part of it. One of the things that was talked about a lot was ensuring that there's enough public support because of issues such as healthcare, affordability, climate change, and all these other issues. Do you think that when we consider 2% of NATO, there's a big tendency to think of actual military equipment, but do you think, I guess, how do you think our allies would perceive it and the public would perceive it if we framed it as, let's say, you're building jobs in cybersecurity, you're building in climate infrastructure, you're building jobs in international supply chains that are focused on clean technologies that can enable further military and civilian technologies such as drones and advanced satellites. So I guess my question is that how do you think that if we focus our efforts in a necessarily non-military aspect of NATO, how do you think that would sell with the public, and how do you think that would sell with our other partners across NATO?
Sure. I mean, I can jump in a little bit on this question. Like, we're seeing this happening already with the links to energy security and climate change, right? And so we were talking a little bit about like promises and whether or not you keep your promises. And so I am working on an entire separate project on our political party campaign promises, which is called Polimeter, and it's run from the Center for Public Policy Analysis at University of Laval. And so if you want to look at these are party platform electoral promises. And so if you want to look at that, if you want a little bit of depression, that's a good place to look. The results are not very good when it comes to foreign policy and defense. And so what this looks like functionally is that for the last, the previous mandated government and the current mandated government, they only managed to fulfill or uphold about 1/4 of their promises in defense and foreign affairs. And Stephanie will not be surprised to hear that they have a particularly difficult time upholding foreign policy promises on women, peace, and security. And so, I think that this says a lot of things, but one of the areas where they do manage to do better upholding promises is if they make an electoral pledge that mentions NATO or NORAD. And so this is interesting because it points to that idea that if you kind of internationally tie your hands by saying, look, we have to do this because we made a commitment, you may be able to get that kind of leverage legislatively to get those things done. But the evidence also points to the fact that this does not happen quickly. And Canada has basically already found itself, as we say, in the corner of shame. When it comes to the quadrant of shame, we'll say, not meeting either the 2% nor the 20%. And so, how do you do this when we've basically already kind of found ourselves falling behind? And so I think that's a little bit of a challenge. But we have seen two things I'll say. Linking to climate change will be a way possibly Canada can spend more and make it relevant for defense in NATO. So NATO going into climate change may help Canada. The second thing is that I know that our Canadian diplomats have been talking to folks in Brussels about modernizing the definition of military defense expenditures of NATO defense expenditures, which dates back to 1952. And so it has been modernized to include things like changes in commands and cyber, but it doesn't really, for example, talk to aspects about like critical infrastructure. And so other NATO partners have legislated that nationally into their national security kind of legislation so that then those expenses can be NATO expenses. We have not. And so I think Canada has done a little less well in being creative, like Stephanie said, about kind of getting there and thinking the ways in which we can get there and the Canada-specific ways. And just closing, I would say this isn't the first time that Canada has been behind or needed special circumstances because it hasn't met its expenditures. It also was in trouble in the 1970s. And probably some of us in the audience were alive then. And so remember that there was also, it was a difficult period for spending in Canada. And actually at that time, there was actually a side agreement that kind of gave Canada a little bit of grace that emerged. I don't think we're in a situation where we would get grace today. And so I think Ottawa really needs to be doing more work on the public narrative message.
Maybe I'll just follow up quickly with some initiatives that are meant to do just what Rohan suggested was needed. And I think, you know, some of them are still very nascent. So the Diana initiative is meant to reach out to companies and to accelerate dual use technologies. And so you can see that NATO has thought about this avenue, and Diana has been its response to this opportunity. I think it's still early days to see whether or not this is working as intended, but it is a first step in that direction, at least as far as industry and commercial partners are concerned. Then a much older program is the Science for Peace and Security program, where you see non-NATO entities and non-government entities, whether they're in academia, in the world of science or think tanks, they will bid for specific projects, and they will also pitch some ideas that don't fall necessarily within traditional military areas, and they will get funded to develop those ideas and to provide some recommendations and best practices to NATO. In Canada, something like the Ideas program, I think would be in line with what you're suggesting here, where the Department of National Defense will put out a challenge, how to make the military operates more sustainably in the Arctic, for instance, or how to leverage drone technology for surveillance in the north. And so there's been a number of calls that have gone out to try to get, again, non-government partners and researchers to study the issues that are important for the military, but that are developed outside of the defense research world per se. So you are seeing these funding mechanisms and financial incentives for innovation and partnership in this space. But I think that there needs to be a lot more of that, and then maybe in a more integrated way. So right now it's always targeting specific partners, like it'll be for industry or it'll be for university-based research, but to think about security and defense in a much more integrated and coordinated way is another challenge above and beyond what you just mentioned, but that's probably necessary to achieve the innovation that Canada should go after.
Fantastic. Joanne, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Yes, thank you very much, Olivia. Hi, everyone. My name's Joanne. I'm a PhD candidate in history at Queen's. I studied the early days of NATO under the leadership of Louis Saint-Laurent. My question was actually partially answered, I think, a little bit by what Dr. Kimball said at the beginning of her response to Rohan's question. I'm curious about what you think about the rotating door of ministers in the Trudeau government. We've had 5 foreign affairs ministers and 3 ministers of national defense in the Trudeau government. How does that impact relationship building with our NATO allies? And Dr. Von Plack, you spoke about, meaning what we say and doing what we commit to doing. How does this sort of rotating number of ministers across key platforms as they relate to NATO impact Canada's ability to commit to NATO and to contribute to the alliance?
Maybe I can start there. So I do think it plays a role. I do think it plays a role both on the side of politicians, but also on the military side. There's been a lot of military leadership turn as well. So I guess, in the foreign affairs portfolio and the defense portfolio, but also in the higher echelons of military leadership, there's been a lot of change, and that provides some challenges for foreign and well, so for diplomacy and for defense diplomacy too. And it does present some challenges for coherently articulating a policy. So I think that's been a challenge both for global affairs and for D&D. D&D's policy statement is getting long in the tooth, and the update, apparently the release is imminent, but we're all still waiting in anticipation of that policy. And then on the, in terms of foreign policy, we have discrete statements. So we understand what some of the key priorities are, from the Indo-Pacific to the feminist foreign policy pronouncements, but we don't have a coherent overarching vision that, if we're really being honest, should be guiding the rest. It should be guiding development strategies, should be guiding defense strategies. So I think that is definitely a weakness. That being said, I think that one of the challenges with the political landscape in Canada is that there isn't a huge difference between the liberal position on something like NATO or defense spending and the conservative position. So the two main parties there is like there's not big swings in terms of what they intend to do with either national defense or international commitments via NATO. And so I think that creates a disincentive for action and for standing out. So am I hopeful that things will change dramatically one way or another depending on shifts in government? No, but that kind of stability can also be a good thing, as we've seen by looking south, because then when you dramatically change every 4 years your position, you're seen as a more mercurial ally, and it's also difficult to build on the path that you've set out. So just a bit of a caveat there, because I do think that our foreign and defense policy space creates very few incentives for say politicians, prime ministers especially, to stand out and to make this really an electoral issue.
I'll just briefly mention, Joanne, obviously coming out of the crucible of the formation of NATO, all of those relationships had been forged in the on the anvil of war. Most of the relationships of those who created NATO were built from the Allies defeating Hitler. And so that kind of meeting of minds, that trust that's built up, 100% has always been one of the most important aspects of NATO, to maintain that. And definitely when you've got, as Stephanie was mentioning, so many changes at the top militarily, but then also in the ministers' offices as well, definitely a challenge. Personal relationships and that trust is the main grease that makes the wheels of NATO go. So I agree. It has been an extra challenge, I think.
They did excellent answering the question. I have nothing to add.
Excellent. All right, so I actually think that we have another question in the chat about AI, but I think the previous Rohan's question answered that. So I just want to thank everyone for such a fantastic, substantive and comprehensive end to the NAADSN NATO series. So thank you all for speaking, and thank you everyone for being in the audience.